You're quite an experienced improviser already, and you and your friends are looking to put on a show. You look around and you see that most of the shows hosted by your local improv troupes are short form, that is the sort of sketch comedy base, the sort of games you would play in a workshop. But you want to stand out. You want to put on an improvised play. The sort of technical name for this is long form, and there are a couple different ways of doing it. What we're going to be presenting in this explainer is a genre-based planning mechanism to help you put on a reliable show that's completely different every night. Hi, my name is Ian, and this is how... So, before we begin making a plan, let's think a little bit about what an improvised play is. What are its advantages and disadvantages as a medium? And the obvious point to begin with is it's improvised, which means there's no script. So the lines, the characters, and most of the plot points are all made up on the spot. And as a direct result of this, the show is almost always performed to a live audience. Now, performing to a live audience is terrifying, and being asked to perform to a live audience without a script is doubly so, but actually this live performance is your biggest advantage. Because the audience is live, you can talk to them, you can ask them questions. And that means you can incorporate their answers to their questions into your show. If you ask them, hey, where's the show taking place? And they say, oh, it's taking place in a castle. Every time you bring up the fact that your show is taking place in a castle, they will become more invested because they go, hey, that castle, I did that castle, that was me. In a very similar sense, every audience has a slightly different type of humor. In a scripted play, this means that different audiences will laugh more at different jokes any given night. But for an improvised play, this means that you can seize on to what your given audience's sense of humor is. Let's say one day they were really into like jokes about people's grandmothers, and next day, not so into grandmothers, more into like jokes about flowers and flower salesmen. Depending on what your audience is into, you can then change your play to have more of that. So you can cater to their subconscious opinions as well as just the thing that they've outright told you. Of course, this freedom does have its downsides. For one, there are a lot of tools which are available to scripted shows which you won't be able to use at all. A good example of this is sort of complicated set pieces, big props. All these things require a lot of planning time, and you just don't have that when you're making up everything live on the spot. You may even decide to not use costumes because you can't plan the costume changes in the same way you would for a scripted show. So a lot of the responsibility for defining the world around you will come down to the physicality of your actors. How do they mime? How do their characters move? How do they talk? Because that's how the audience is going to get most of their information about the world. The medium is also more favorable to some genres than others, and a large part this is due to the fact that improvisation is a collaboration between a group of people, but it's a collaboration where they can only communicate with each other via their performance. This means everybody's going to have a slightly different idea of what's going on in their own head, and they're also going to forget a couple things. And this will lead to a few things that don't make sense, a couple continuity errors. These continuity errors will impact a more serious show than a more comedic one. Comedic one, you can kind of laugh off the mistakes, but if there's a serious error in a serious point of a serious show, that's going to be a lot harder to deal with. Part of the reason why improvisation is so often linked to comedy is also because comedy is just an easier thing to do when you make it up on the spot. You have more practice with it. When you're with your friends, a lot of the time you're trying to get them to laugh, and because of that, it's going to be easier just by what you do on a day-to-day basis, what you practice the most. Making people laugh is going to be easier than making them cry. So any step you take towards being serious, towards trying to evoke like deep, non-comedic emotions as your primary goal, is going to be one little increment by which doing this becomes fun. In other words, it's an inherently goofy medium, and you have to work super hard to establish tone and story. But on the plus side, the audience knows this. They've come to your show expecting it to be a little bit janky, and, actually their expectations for your improv show is probably quite low. And although that may sound disheartening, low expectations are a chance to exceed them. And that's what we're going to teach you how to do. Well, what do you want? You want a show that makes the most use of the improv format while still being reliably high class. To get high quality, you'll need some sort of methodology or structure, but to get the most out of the improv format, you want that structure to be as loose as possible to give you room to play. While it is possible to have no structure whatsoever, in most cases having some sort of plan is a good idea. If you want to take audience suggestions, which I would encourage you to do, you'll at the bare minimum need to plan out when and how you're going to take those suggestions. You'll be working to a tight time budget too, so a good structure will also manage the pacing of your show, making sure you end on time and in a satisfactory way. Fortunately, a whole bunch of nice marketable structures are already out there. They're called genres, and they're marketable for the same reason that they make great structures. When somebody hears the name of a genre, horror for example, they associate with that name a whole bunch of tropes, stock characters, of things that usually happen, plot beats. And by making that association, they will then come into your show with an expectation for what will be in it. If the audience already knows what's going to be going into your show, then all you need to do in your structure is make sure that all those things can happen. So, my recommendation is to watch as much media as possible in that genre, preferably things that are also kind of silly, because improv is kind of a silly medium anyway. As you're doing this, take a note of how these media structure their plots and subplots, of what sort of characters are always there, and whether or not there's normally some sort of narration. These things will make up the meat of your show. They're the things that the improvisers can do on a given night to make the audience go, oh yes, this is a show in that genre, because they will pick up on it. At the same time as you're looking at what the meat is, you should also be looking for the bones. And what I mean by the bones is the plot structures which come up the most. I write show structures by looking at my list of story beats and then picking which of those few will fit the best into the hour-long period that I have to work with. I then think about when and how we're going to talk to the audience and end our show. How much time will these two things take up? Factor that in. Finally, I ask myself if there are more genre-savvy ways of doing things. Is there a certain type of narration which fits well with the medium and the genre? Is there some sort of game we could be playing as improvisers which would be more appropriate to this genre than it would be to others? And should we then fit that in? Now, on its own, that probably hasn't given too much guidance. So let's look at... So, for our example, let's talk about horror detective comedies. And by that, I mean Scooby-Doo. Watched a bunch of Scooby-Doo episodes, and I've come across a sort of general pattern. First scene, something spooky happens. Some sort of monster shows up in a place. Step 2, little bit in the future, we find the Scooby Gang, so Scooby-Doo and her friends, coming to that place. Step 3, they find out about whatever spooky thing has been going on. And step 4, they meet a bunch of people who are also suspects as the people who are causing the monster to happen. Because in the Scooby-Doo universe, 95% of the time, the monsters aren't real. This is one of those little neat things which is going to happen. So in our plot, we're going to have the monster not be real in the end. Step 5, they split up and look for clues. Step 6, somebody, Shaggy and Scooby or Daphne, encounters the monster. Step 7, they escape, everybody reunites. And step 8 is sort of the final scene where they trap the monster, rip the mask off, and reveal the culprit. Then the 9th point I've just put is the show ends. Now, let's take that structure and pretend we're preparing a 1-hour show with 5 improvisers. We automatically block off the first 10 minutes at the start of the show, where we plan to take suggestions from the audience. And we say we're aiming to finish 55 minutes after we start, so we have 5 minutes of wiggle room so we don't overrun. This leaves us 45 minutes. The first change I'm going to make is that I'll say that because we only have 5 actors total, we can't have 5 people playing detective. I'll arbitrarily say that we'll only have 2 people trying to solve the mystery. The other 3 will play the locals to the place we're investigating. We now go through those bones point by point and ask, do we really need this? Point 1 introduces the place, which is good. It introduces 2 characters, also good. It also introduces the monster. So all of a sudden, point 1 brings a lot of information and juicy details to the show. Point 1 is great. In addition to this, we also have that 2 of the local people have been introduced to the audience. This means that the 3rd person has no alibi. And so it's very easy to say, just make as a rule, that that third person is going to be the person revealed to be responsible for the monster at the end. This means that all of our improvisers can be on the same page about what that final reveal is going to be, and also it gives the audience a chance to figure out who will have done it beforehand, if they're just sort of thinking about, well, those two people can't have been the monster, therefore it has to be the third. This is called foreshadowing, and it's actually really hard to do in improv. So any chance to sort of build it in off the bat is a great option. In other words, point one is great, it stays, and we're going to say specifically that point one corresponds to the first scene of our show. Points 2 and 3 in an actual Scooby-Doo episode are largely to address continuity. They're there to justify why the gang is investigating where they are, and why they know what they do. Obviously, continuity is important. So we do need to include something about why these detectives are in this place and why they're investigating. Okay? Cool. Second scene of our play needs to justify why the detectives are there and have them find out what's going on. Now, in improv, there's a heuristic, who, what, where, which we use to remind ourselves that in each scene, we, the improvisers, need to have established who we are, where we are, and what we're doing, and that we need to have communicated this information to the audience. This is so everybody's on the same page about the reality of the scene, and it's a necessary step to making sure that comedy can happen, because if you're just disagreeing about the reality of your fictional world, that's not very funny most of the time. We can apply a similar heuristic to the show as a whole. What I mean by this is we say that in our show, the audience needs to know who all of the characters are. They need to have been fully characterized. We need to know something about what they want, something about how they act, etc., etc. The audience also needs to know things about where they are. They need to know things about the place, the environment. What is the history of this place where the monster is? And finally, they need to know what's happening. They need to have a sense of plot. In our first scene, we established two of the characters, the two locals in that scene, and we learned a little about the place and a little about the monster. Now we have the second scene, which involves the two detective characters entering the setting and finding out what's going on. To do this, they probably need to talk to one of the locals, and it just so happens that we have one local who hasn't been introduced yet. Terrific! The second scene involves the three characters who haven't been introduced yet, so this is our chance to introduce them. The final thing I'll mention about scene 2 involves points 4 and 5. Now, in general, it's a good idea to have each of your characters have a relationship with as many of the other characters as possible. This gives the audience variety as to who's in scenes doing what with who, and it gives you options for those exact same things. Therefore, having the detectives split up as soon as possible is a great idea. Now, because you can meet all of the shady characters after you split up as well as before, I suggest we end the scene 2 with the detectives going their separate ways, and move all of the meeting the characters, all of the investigation to after the fact. Cool. We planned the first 2 scenes, which probably accounts for between 7 and 10 minutes of runtime. I would then suggest that we leave the next 20 minutes or so open. This gives the improvisers a chance to play around a bit and riff off their ideas. A good long-form show consists of a creation and conclusion phase. In the creation phase, the idea is to throw out as many ideas as possible and develop those ideas to create a rich and compelling and weird world, to learn things about your characters and to develop in-jokes with the audience. The conclusion phase is all about taking all the ideas you created and weaving them back together to create an ending that makes sense in the context that you've set up previously. Therefore, after 20 minutes or so of just messing around, I suggest that we begin the concluding phase 40 minutes after we started, with point 6. They personally encounter the monster. I think that this should happen only to one of the detectives, because they'll still be separated at that point, and we don't really want to have the same thing happen to 2 different characters one after the other. At some point after this, the 2 detectives get together and talk about how they're going to trap the monster, drawing off ideas from the creation phase. The final scene then begins at minute 50, and consists of the detectives trapping the monster and revealing who is responsible. There we go. That's our show structure in a nutshell. The final thing we need to do is figure out how we're going to interact with the audience in those first 10 minutes to get the prompts that we want and prompts that we can work with. The options are pretty much limitless, but two things I will suggest is either you can have an open question, which you ask to one person, and then they tell you a slightly longer story. From that long story, you can then pick out details. Or, what I've done previously, and I think works quite well, ask quite a few more specific questions. So, our Scooby-Doo example involves a place and a monster. So how about you ask, where's somewhere you went on holiday, and what's a weird tradition? And then use those two things to build both the place and the monster. We then trust our improvisers to weave that back into the story, and we're off. No, but seriously, that's how it starts. You have a working show structure, so the only thing left to do is trial and error it until it's a good show structure. Go, do a run through without an audience with that show structure. See what you feel like works, see what doesn't. Come back the next week, try again, and keep on just tweaking it until you've had 3 or 4 really good shows in a row. Then you're ready. And as you rehearse, you find you'll become closer and closer with your friends to the point where you're all very much pulling in the same direction almost all the time. You're gonna have a great show. Have a good time with it. But seriously though, this time